Good afternoon, grade 9s. Today I'm going to treat the following with you: trade unions. That is one of the most important one of the most important parts of the grade 9s for the second part of the year. So let's look at what I have in store for you today. Number 1, trade unions in South Africa and industrial action is what we're actually going to look at today. Number 1, what is the definition of trade unions? Trade unions is organizations formed by workers to protect their rights and improve their working conditions. So the most important part here is that it's formed by workers and it is there to improve the working conditions. What is the role of the trade union? It represents workers' interest, negotiate collective agreements. What does collective agreements mean? It means when you are standing together and decided on something together, not one by one, and then advocate for workers' rights so that workers are treated correctly. The largest trade union federation in South Africa is COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions. And what that means is that it's one body that takes a lot of unions under their umbrella, and they then collectively represent those different unions. Then number 1, let's quickly look at a short history of unions in South Africa. In the late 19th century, trade unions started to come in the forefront in South Africa to fight for workers' rights and for social justice. It was significant during the apartheid era, where they fought against the discrimination and exploitation of workers. And then they were instrumental in shaping the labor laws and policies after 1994 in the post-apartheid regime. So if you look at that, then trade unions have a long history in South Africa. If we look at the notable trade unions in South Africa, first, as we said, is COSATU, is the largest trade union federation, and it represents various sectors in South Africa. Then you have NUM, it represents mine workers and a significant presence in the mining industry. Then we have SATAWU, represents workers in the transportation sector. We have NAHAWU, represents workers in education, health, and allied sectors. POPCRU represents people or workers and police officers and correctional service workers. And then we also have now NUMSA presents workers in the metal engineering sector. This is just a few of them that we can name. We also have SATU, that is the education trade union, and so on. So it is never ending. So what is the responsibilities of a trade union in South Africa? Number 1, it must protect workers' rights, ensuring that there is fair wages, safe working conditions, and job security. Then collective bargaining, negotiate better terms of employment through agreements with the employers. So they go and they take what you want as a worker to the employer. Then advocacy and representation, they represent workers in dispute and advocate for workers' interests. So when there's a problem with you and your employer, they can therefore then represent you. Then provide service support and services. They offer legal assistance. They give advice, and most of the time, a lot of times, they also give training opportunities. And then promoting equality and social justice by fighting against discrimination and unfair practices. The next thing that is important is if we look at what is, let me just look here, the influence of trade unions on businesses. What is their influence? Number 1, labor relations. It has an impact on negotiations and the establishment of fair labor practices. That means that you work only 8 hours a day, for instance, and if you work more than that, then it's overtime. Then workforce productivity ensures better working conditions so that you work in a safe place, and employee satisfaction. Workplace regulation, it advocates for policies to protect workers' rights, something like maybe you have 15 days leave in a year, or you get overtime. Balance of power, provide a counterbalance for employers' powers that the employees also have a say. And then industrial action, sometimes they can organize strikes and other actions to address their demands. Then you must remember that unions has a very big influence as well on sustainable growth and development. Why? Because they fight for economic equality, they fight for fair wages and reducing of income inequalities so that everybody get a fair chance. They look at social welfare, they advocate for improved social welfare programs, especially at work. Say, for instance, they have a mental health program or something like that they can look at. Then skills development, they provide training and enhance employability. So they sometimes give you training on stuff that you don't know so much about so that you can put it on your CV and then apply for a job. Then worker empowerment, empowering workers in decision-making processes. So they help you to make the correct decision for the correct situation. And then democratic practices, they promote transparency and accountability, especially then from your employees. Next up, we have actions that trade unions can take. Remember now that if they go to your employer and they do not find what they don't get what they want, what can they do? They can take industrial action. So what is that? It's a collective action to protest or negotiate or express grievances. Now you must remember, you're first going to express your grievance, then you're going to negotiate, and in the end you will protest. It's not something that will immediately happen. What kind of industrial action is there? You have strikes, that's the one that we are most familiar with in South Africa. Work stoppages, so for instance, you sit at work, but you do not work. Slowdowns, so for instance, you might 10 tables a day, now you only do 5 a day. Work to rule, that means that you only do what is in your job description. So if, for instance, you start at 7:30, at exactly 10 o'clock, you have a tea break, exactly 10:15, you come back from your tea break, exactly at 1 o'clock, you have lunch, at 2 o'clock, you come back from lunch. Sit-ins means that you, and occupations mean that you sit there, but you do not actually do something. Then you have something that we call protected and unprotected strikes. This is a very important part of unions. So there's a legal requirement and as well as consequences if your strike is not protected. So you have to get permission to strike. You can't just decide one day, get up in the morning and decide you're not going to go to work. So who is allowed to strike and who is not and why? Let's look. The right to strike in South Africa is recognized and protected by the Constitution. So we are allowed to strike, but there are limitations. For instance, essential services employees and public servants have stricter regulations. For instance, you can think of a hospital. If the nurses decide they're not going to come to work, it's going to have far-fetching consequences for the patients there. Okay, then in industrial actions, if there's a strike or a sit-in or a work to rule or something, it has influence on the economy. So what is it? There's a loss of productivity. Disruptions lead to a loss of productivity, and then there's a loss of output. That's something that happened in South Africa in the mining sector a lot. There was a lot of industrial actions a few years ago, and that had a huge influence on the productivity, and there were actually companies excuse me, that took their business away from South Africa. Then there's economic costs. Remember that you have financial losses because in South Africa, it's the work to no work, no pay principle is applied. For instance, if you strike, you do not get paid. Then there's a supply and chain disruptions that will affect goods and services. For instance, if there is a disruption in, for instance, transport, then food will not get to the shops on time, and then there will be a disruption in that. Investor confidence, remember, if it does not look as if the labor is stable in South Africa, then there will not be investor confidence, and the investor will not put his money in South Africa. And then negotiation and policy changes. This is a positive one. It can influence labor policies and better your conditions at your work. So this is my story. Remember to complete your attendance register. There's the link that I will also share on the group just now, as well as the QR code. I hope that you get the gist of what a trade union and its job is. Remember the following few important concepts. Collective bargaining, meaning that you as a whole, say for instance, if I can explain it just a little bit more, you have a bulldog and you have a Rottweiler and you have one Jack Russell. If the Rottweiler go for the Jack Russell is going to die. But if you have 10 Jack Russells and one Rottweiler, then the Rottweiler is in trouble. That is collective bargaining. Always remember also that there's no work, no pay. Remember what COSATU is, and please look at things like the sustainability and the influence that trade unions have on the growth, economic growth, as well on labor relations. Thank you for your time.